The dawn wind descended from the Cascade Ridge with a biting ferocity that reminded Elena Morrison just how close winter loomed over Redemption Falls, Montana. She stood barefoot on the weathered porch, one hand supporting her aching back, the other cradling her belly, 8 months pregnant, exhausted, and drowning in dread. Have you ever felt like everything you've built is crumbling beneath your feet? The house moaned in the wind, half-rotted shingles trembling, paint stripped to bare gray, her family's legacy reduced to kindling. The baby stirred inside her, pressing against her ribs with defiance that made her chest ache with love and grief. "Easy now, little one," she murmured. "You're not the only one waiting." Elena's husband, Marcus Morrison, had been dead 7 months, a barn accident, instant, brutal. She still saw his boots beneath collapsed hay bales, crimson spreading. She'd found him. She'd screamed so loud the hawks fled the canyon. Now all that remained was this ranch, the land his grandfather broke open, and the suffocating mortgage Marcus left behind. His boots sat inside the door, aligned as he'd always done. Their positioning anchored her, false hope he might return. But hope doesn't pay $19,800 in overdue mortgage payments. IRS letters multiplied in the drawer. The rotting barn roof, broken pump, hay she couldn't afford. Each problem compounded until the weight threatened to crush her. Then there was the auction. That God-forsaken spectacle every second Saturday where desperate men stood on a platform like livestock, offering themselves to the highest bidder for food and shelter. Dorothy Henderson, Marcus's godmother, first mentioned it while attacking biscuit dough. "Work for shelter auctions this weekend. You've got a collapsing barn and a baby coming. What's your plan? Wait until snow buries you both?" Elena stared at lukewarm coffee, silent. You can't manage a 1,000-acre ranch alone with an infant. Hell, you can barely manage now. Sometimes the hardest truths come from those who love us most. Elena couldn't imagine standing in town square, 8 months pregnant, bidding on a man like breeding stock. It felt wrong. But debt collectors didn't care about dignity. The county inspector had slapped a warning on the barn, unfit for livestock. Dorothy's final words. Sometimes a woman's got to make peace with pride before she can make room for survival. 2 days later, Elena knew she couldn't wait for miracles. She needed hands, strength, someone to hold this place together before winter stripped everything bare. She pulled on Marcus's ranch jacket and grabbed her checkbook. $273.29. Room and board, maybe $50 monthly. She'd offer what little she had with pride, not pity. What would you sacrifice to save everything you've ever loved? By the time they reached the courthouse square, Redemption Falls had gathered like vultures. Elena sat rigid in Dorothy's Ford, staring at the platform, weathered planks above gravel. In this town, it was a stage for public humiliation. Men clustered to the side, ragtag and displaced. Military coats with faded patches, mechanics with oil-stained hands. None smiled. They leaned against posts, avoided eyes, wore the weight of being stripped to nothing but their backs and skills. Elena felt the sting from across the lot. Her desperation screamed as loud as confession. "They're not property," she muttered. "They're human beings. They're men who need work. You need help. Don't romanticize this." Dorothy's voice was iron. "Pick one who can keep your roof from killing you. You're not buying a man, you're buying survival." Tommy Eldridge, the auctioneer, stepped up. "Thank you for showing up. Our community gives good men second chances. These gentlemen offer honest labor for room and board. Remember, kindness costs less than regret." Elena nearly snorted. Tommy had never worked hard a day in his life. He profited from overdue bills and default interest. How many of us profit from others' desperation without realizing it? The first man, barely 20, went for $60 and a converted chicken coop. Elena pressed her hand to her belly. The baby rolled like it sensed something wrong. One after another, men were paraded up, skills read like clearance items, each claimed by someone, some with kindness, others seeking cheap labor. Then he stepped up. Elena wasn't sure what captured her attention, his stillness or how he didn't belong there. Tall, broad-shouldered, posture commanding quiet presence. Eyes gray-green like Spring Creek water. He carried only a canvas sack and oilcoat. Clean boots, scarred hands unashamed of honest work. Garrett Stone, 33, no fixed address. Ranch work in 3 states, 101st Airborne. Carpentry, mechanical repair, livestock handling. Quiet fella. Elena sat straighter. Dorothy exhaled. He's been through something. You can see it. Bidding erupted immediately. 100, 125, 150. Elena's heart sank. She couldn't compete. But Garrett carried himself like someone who'd survived too much to be cheap. The price climbed. 175, 200. Then Richard Kane, the town banker, stepped from his black truck. 250. Then immediately, 300. Garrett stood like a mountain waiting for weather to change. We've got 300. Do I hear more? Elena opened the truck door. Elena, you don't have the money. I'm not going to outbid him. Sometimes courage isn't about having the most resources, it's about offering what truly matters. She stepped out, pregnancy unmistakable as she crossed the lot. Whispering started. Some chuckled. One man laughed. She looked only at Garrett. I can't offer 300. What I can offer is $50 monthly, a dry place to sleep, hot meals, and a ranch needing fixing more than pity. I can't give much, but I promise this. I'll treat you like a man, not a commodity. I'll respect your work, dignity, and humanity. Absolute silence. Gasps. Lord have mercy. Richard Kane laughed. You're joking. You can't make up your own rules. But Garrett's voice cut through like a knife. I'll take her offer. No hesitation. Tommy looked slapped. That ain't how this works. It is today. You run an auction, not a slave trade. I'm not cattle. I choose where I work and who I work for. He stopped before Elena, tipping his head respectfully. If the offer's still open, ma'am, I'd be honored to work your land. Elena nodded, stunned, hand on her belly as if her baby understood something profound had occurred. Dorothy clapped once, slow and deliberate. Well, looks like you just got yourself one hell of a cowboy. When was the last time you stood up for what you believed in? The ride back was silent but comfortable. Garrett insisted on sitting in the truck bed, claiming he preferred open air. As they rolled toward the Morrison property, he studied the land, sagging fences, half-collapsed barn roof, distant creek, with the attention of a carpenter studying warped wood for bones that could be rebuilt. When they arrived, he immediately offered to unload supplies. Without waiting for permission, he hauled grain sacks, fencing wire, and a battered toolbox with ease, suggesting his body knew hard labor like breathing. Dorothy pointed him to the bunkhouse. Elena had cleaned it the week prior, scrubbed mouse droppings, washed wool blankets smelling of cedar and tobacco. It wasn't much, but it was warm, dry, honest. Garrett said nothing about sparse conditions. He nodded, set down his sack, and rolled up his sleeves. His first job wasn't the roof or fence or dying pump. It was the barn door, a task most would overlook. But Garrett understood that in a place hanging by threads, even small repairs could shift the air. He disassembled warped hinges with quiet efficiency, sanded swollen wood, reinforced it with salvaged iron brackets. By sundown, the barn door no longer screeched. It slid smooth as a sigh, and Elena blinked back tears she didn't understand. He didn't ask for thanks. He just worked, steady, silent, deliberate, like the land was something sacred he'd been entrusted to tend. What if the help we need most comes in the quietest forms? Over following days, rhythm settled between them. Elena cooked meals that never felt like enough, but Garrett always accepted with quiet thanks. He never sat until every chore was done, never asked for more than offered, never crossed the invisible line grief and decency had drawn. But Elena noticed small things, how he kept distance when she moved through the yard, hand on belly, how he left tools arranged neatly by the door, respecting not just her home, but her autonomy. How he spoke more to horses than people, using quiet tones that soothed even anxious geldings. Then came the day he fixed the pump. It had been sputtering for weeks. Marcus had rigged it repeatedly, but Elena knew it was dying. She'd begun hauling buckets from the creek, but Garrett took the challenge as personal insult to the land's dignity. She found him one morning laid on frozen ground beneath the pump house, covered in mud and grit, maneuvering an old wrench with reverence most reserved for prayer. He worked until his hands bled, until the engine coughed, stuttered, then roared to life like it had been waiting for someone to remember its language. Elena stood watching water spill clean and cold. For the first time in forever, something lifted from her chest, the weight of doing everything alone. When Garrett emerged, wiping his hands, she said, "You saved us $100 we didn't have." He replied, "Didn't do it for the money." That night after supper, They sat on the porch together for the first time. Dorothy had retired early, giving them space. The sky was awash in stars. Silence stretched between them. "You were married long?" Garrett asked finally. Elena stared into darkness. 10 years. He was good. Not perfect, but real. Honest. Garrett nodded. "That counts for more than people think." After a while, Elena asked, "You ever been?" He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was soft. "Once." Then he stood, tipped his hat, and walked to the bunkhouse. Elena sat there long after, one hand on her stomach, heart thudding with something she didn't want to name yet. Not hope exactly, but the memory of how hope used to feel. Have you ever felt hope returning when you least expected it? The next morning, the baby kicked harder than usual. Elena whispered, "He's not Marcus, but I think he might be the kind of man your father would have trusted." Weeks followed with strange grace, as though time paused to allow healing into spaces where pain once lived. Autumn deepened, draping the valley in amber and rust. The ranch began looking less like a forgotten relic and more like a place preparing for something new. Fences no longer sagged. The barn roof no longer threatened collapse. Even the chickens, neglected since Marcus died, returned to roost, sensing order had returned. Garrett had become constant presence, not just on the land but in Elena's thoughts. He worked sunup to sundown with quiet efficiency, but she began noticing subtle wear beneath his calm. She saw it in how his shoulders sometimes slumped when he thought no one watched, how he hesitated before entering the kitchen, unsure whether he belonged inside her world's warmth and light. Elena tried not to ask questions. She respected boundaries, his and her own. She had her grief, he had his, and that silent understanding had become the bridge between them. But one night after supper, something changed. It had been a long day hauling feed, repairing gates, wrangling a stray calf. Dorothy had gone to town, and Elena heated leftover stew. They ate in near silence, only spoons clinking against ceramic and wind whistling through windowsills. After dishes were done and lamps turned low, Garrett lingered near the door, hand on the frame like he might walk out, or might be waiting for her to ask him not to. "You ever wish you'd left?" he asked, not looking at her, voice nearly dissolving into the house's hum. Elena, sitting in Marcus's old chair by the fireplace with swollen feet propped up, didn't pretend to misunderstand. She folded her hands over her belly and studied him in flickering firelight. "There were days I did. But then I'd remember who built this place, what it meant to him, and what it means to this baby." Garrett nodded slowly, fingers curling around the frame, as if her words pulled him back from whatever edge he'd been standing on. "I left everything," he said after a long pause. "Back in Oregon, the land, the house, things we built together, me and Sarah. I left it all the morning after she died." First time he'd said her name, Elena felt something tighten in her chest. Not jealousy, but deep recognition of that kind of loss. "She was your wife?" He nodded. "She died slow. Cancer. The kind that doesn't respond but keeps you hoping. We tried everything. Doctors, specialists, diets, prayer circles. Still, every morning she was smaller, weaker. One day she was just gone." Elena waited, making space for whatever he needed to let fall. "She was pregnant when we found out," Garrett said finally, words landing like stones in still water. 16 weeks. Doctors said the baby might survive if we started treatment late, but she didn't want to risk it. Said if she only had time for one life, it wasn't going to be hers." Elena pressed her hand to her belly instinctively, tears rising with ferocity that left her breathless. She could barely imagine the weight of that decision, the love it would take to choose someone else's future over your own. But it didn't matter. Cancer spread faster than expected. The baby didn't make it past week 20, and by then it was too late to save her. He turned slowly, face illuminated by hearth glow, and Elena saw in his expression the full devastation of a man who'd carried too much grief too long. "I stayed just long enough to bury them. Then I drove until I couldn't anymore. Been moving ever since." Elena didn't speak. Instead, she stood slowly, one hand bracing her belly, the other reaching for him. He came to her like he was afraid to touch her, like his hands might break something sacred. But when her fingers closed around his, the tension in his frame released all at once. "You don't have to keep carrying it alone," she said. "Not here. Not anymore." He didn't respond with words. He just pulled her hand to his chest, pressing it where his heart beat slow and strong beneath cotton. They stood that way for a long time. Not lovers yet, but no longer strangers, tethered by grief and choice and the quiet promise that healing didn't always need to be loud or fast. Sometimes it came in shared silence and willingness to stand still long enough to be seen. What burdens are you carrying that you were never meant to carry alone? That night, Elena didn't sleep much. The baby was restless, kicking like it was ready to arrive ahead of schedule. She sat by the window, watching the moon trace its arc over fields, hands cradling the life inside her, and mind wrapped around the man asleep in the bunkhouse. She wasn't sure what would come next, how pieces of their broken pasts would fit together, but for the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was bracing for another loss. Instead, she felt unfamiliar but welcome stirrings of something she hadn't dared name in years: possibility. By mid-October, weather shifted with suddenness that made trees shudder and animals uneasy. Wind barreled down from hills like it carried warning, rustling cottonwoods until golden leaves let go all at once, blanketing the valley floor. Elena could feel the season tightening its grip, not just on land but on her body. Her breath came shallower, belly stretched taut, ankles swollen. She could no longer pretend exhaustion wasn't claiming her. The doctor said she had 2 weeks, maybe 3, but Elena knew better. Women who worked land knew their own bodies, knew how to listen to silence, instinct, faint messages whispered through muscle and bone. The baby had dropped lower. Her back ached deep in her spine. Every now and then pain would catch her mid-step, not strong enough to stop her completely, but persistent enough to say, soon. Garrett had noticed. He didn't say much, but she caught how he watched her more closely now, glances longer, pauses more frequent whenever she rose from a chair or bent to pick something up. He'd started handling morning chores entirely on his own, even things she'd insisted she could still do. It wasn't coddling. It was quiet protection, the kind that didn't ask permission and didn't demand acknowledgement. Still, walls between them, though thinner now, remained standing. She continued wearing Marcus's ring, not because she clung to the past, but because the past clung to her. It was etched into porch posts Marcus had carved, into the kitchen counter he'd sanded smooth, into the child growing inside her that carried his name as a middle name already chosen. But lately she'd caught herself twisting the ring without realizing it, spinning it slowly, then stopping, as if waiting for some sign she couldn't name. It was a Friday night when the storm came in, not from the west as usual, but curling from the north, riding low and fast and furious. Wind kicked up without warning, slamming shutters and sending horses into nervous frenzy. Elena stood in the kitchen doorway, one hand braced against the frame, breath caught as Garrett sprinted from bunkhouse to barn, coat flaring behind him like wings. Dorothy had already thrown extra hay into stalls, but younger cattle were still loose in the lower pasture, and Garrett refused to let the storm catch them without shelter. Elena wanted to yell after him, "Be careful. Take the truck. Remember, no one could save every calf." But she said nothing. Some men needed to meet storms head-on, and some women knew better than to stop them. She was halfway through boiling water to warm his supper when the first contraction hit. It wasn't sharp or dramatic like movies showed, but low and deep and final in its arrival. It rolled through her abdomen like a wave that had taken all its time crossing some distant ocean, and now there would be no going back. She gripped the counter edge, breathing through it, not panicking. She'd expected this. The baby had been knocking harder each night, shifting like it was tired of waiting. Still, as she pressed a palm to her stomach and whispered to the child, "All right, little one, we'll do this your way," she couldn't help but feel the sudden absence of steady boots on the floor beside her. Dorothy returned just as Elena was folding a towel under her knees on the living room floor. Wind screamed around the eaves like something wounded, and windows pulsed with cold. Elena looked up through the ache and exhaled a single word: "It's time." Dorothy's years of weather-hardened instinct took over without hesitation. They moved like women who had delivered calves and buried husbands and stitched up barbed wire cuts with steady hands. Clean sheets, boiling water, a knife from the drawer, sanitized in a basin. Elena didn't cry out, not from pride, but from understanding that pain was a contract signed long ago in blood and breath. She endured it the way she had endured everything else. Silently, completely, with strength that didn't need applause. But as pains sharpened, Dorothy frowned and pressed her ear to Elena's belly, expression shifting from focus to grim concern. "She's turned," Dorothy muttered. "Breach. That baby's not where she ought to be." Elena blinked against sweat on her forehead, voice barely audible. "Will she make it?" Dorothy hesitated only a moment before nodding. "She's stubborn like her mama, but you're going to have to trust me." The next hour passed in a blur of heat and ice, of whispered prayers and clenched jaws, of Garrett not returning and time sliding sideways like ice down a hill. Then, just as Dorothy reached for the kitchen lamp to better see the child's position, the smell of smoke curled in through the baseboards. Elena's eyes snapped open. "The barn." Dorothy froze. The sound of horses screaming rose above the wind, and in that instant, the contractions, the blood, the ache, none of it mattered compared to the image of Garrett alone in the barn, surrounded by panic and flame. Elena gritted her teeth as another wave of pain crashed through her, and through it she heard a voice, hoarse, breathless, urgent. "I'm here." Garrett burst through the door, face streaked with soot, coat scorched at the hem, but eyes locked on Elena like she was the only thing in the world that made sense. "There's fire," Dorothy said, not needing to explain. "I know, I contained it. Just need to get them fed from the south silo until I can finish putting it out." Elena's breath hitched. "I can't do this without you," she whispered. And in one motion he was beside her, kneeling in the blood and towels and raw beauty of labor. He didn't flinch, he didn't hesitate, he just took her hand and said, "Then I won't leave." In our darkest moments, who shows up for us? The rest came in one long, unbroken hour. An hour filled with firelight and wind and pain and strength, with Dorothy's voice steady as a hymn and Garrett's grip anchoring Elena to this earth as her body tore itself open to bring forth new life. And then, in the heart of the storm, the baby cried, a sound so fierce and high it seemed to split the roof beams. A cry not of helplessness, but of defiance, of arrival. Elena sobbed once, just once, as Dorothy lifted the child and declared, "A girl. Strong lungs, too." Garrett looked down at the tiny creature now swaddled in towels, face blotchy, fists tight as stones, and then he looked at Elena. "I've never seen anything braver," he said, voice rough and reverent. She reached for him, tears streaking her soot-stained cheeks. "She needs a name," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "I've got one, if it's all right with you." Elena nodded, the baby warm against her chest, her own heartbeat finally slowing after hours of battle. "Say it." "Lily," Garrett said. "My mother's name." Elena closed her eyes and held the child closer. "Then Lily she is." Outside, the wind finally quieted. The flames had not won. The barn stood, blackened at the edges but upright. And inside that fragile, weather-beaten house, 3 people who had once been strangers now sat at the center of something fierce and unbreakable. Not a family formed by blood, but one built by survival, by choice, by the courage to stand together when everything else had fallen apart. What will you build from the ashes of what you've lost? 6 months later, spring arrived in Redemption Falls with gentle insistence that made even hardened ranchers believe in second chances. The Morrison Ranch, once a monument to decay, now hummed with purposeful life. The barn roof had been completely rebuilt. Fences stood straight and strong. The pump ran smoothly and cattle grazed contentedly in carefully rotated pastures. Elena stood on that same warped porch where her story began, but everything felt different now. Baby Lily slept peacefully in a sling against her chest, tiny fist curled around Elena's finger with surprising strength. Garrett emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, and when he looked up and saw them standing there, his face broke into a smile. Rare, genuine, transformative. He'd stopped sleeping in the bunkhouse 3 months ago. The transition had been gradual, natural, like water finding its level. They hadn't rushed anything, hadn't forced what wasn't ready, but they also hadn't denied what was growing between them. Marcus's ring now hung on a chain around Elena's neck, close to her heart but no longer binding her to the past. She'd made peace with loving what was and embracing what could be. "You ready?" Garrett asked, climbing the porch steps. "Ready," Elena confirmed. They were heading into town, not for an auction this time, but for a celebration. The bank had officially approved their loan restructuring, and the ranch was no longer in danger of foreclosure. More than that, they were going to file paperwork to make Garrett a legal partner in the ranch. Not just a hired hand, not just someone passing through, but someone who belonged. As they loaded into the truck, Dorothy already waiting with a knowing smile, Elena took one last look at the land that had nearly broken her and had ultimately saved her. Sometimes the life we're meant to live looks nothing like the one we planned. And sometimes that's exactly how it's supposed to be. Your story isn't over. What chapter will you write next? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that second chances are real, that hope can return, and that the family we build is just as powerful as the family we're born into. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Start building your second chance today.